My name is Brandon Laviolette. I am the Treatment Health and Wellness Coordinator at Positive Living BC. So I would like to welcome you all. Thank you for coming to our community forum today. Today we're going to be, the topic of our community forum today is called Alcohol Dialogues. And we're going to talk about health issues, a little bit of health issues for people living with HIV. Overall, this is really meant to be a discussion about moderate drinking in our community. So I have just a few announcements, and then we will get started. So, a few announcements. I just wanted to remind everyone that we have dental health programs at Positive Living. So we recently opened the Positive Living Community Dental Clinic, and that's in our main floor at 1101 Seymour Street. It's a full-service dental clinic that's available to the community. We have a lot of members that are using this dental clinic. We have some great dentists who are able to offer some really great services. And they specialize in treating people living with HIV. One of the most unique opportunities for people living with HIV to access dental health in our community. In addition to that, we have had, for about the last 10 years, the dental hygiene program at UBC offers a free dental hygiene program. And that is upstairs in our upstairs fourth floor clinic. And just for people who are maybe on benefits, who have limited benefits, this is a really great opportunity for you to go and get your dental hygiene done free of charge, and it can help you stretch out those very limited dental benefits that the ministry offers. We have two new drop-in classes. So for the last few months, we've had Tai Chi on Thursday afternoons, and I want to make sure that everybody understands that Tai Chi program is drop-in. You can just pop in, join the class. They have room for about probably another extra 4 or 5 people right now. It's a growing class, so Thursday afternoons from 3:45 to 5:15 in the lounge on the fourth floor. And then we just started a yoga program, and so our yoga program is getting restarted. Sven is coming in on Fridays at noon, and it'll be on the second floor in our big meeting room. So that goes from noon till 1 p.m. It's not today. So I want to acknowledge that we're gathered here today on the unceded Coast Salish territories, which includes the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'm asking everyone to silence your cell phone. Please put your cell phone on silent or turn it off, just as a courtesy to the presenter and as a courtesy to those around you, so that we can facilitate that discussion. If you don't already know, the toilet is out the back door to the left, all the way at the end of the hall.
Literally.
Today, we actually have this presentation available on webinar, so we actually don't have anyone signing up today, but we always have these available on webinar for people who are out in the community around BC and the world who may want to join in on this discussion. And we invite everyone here to participate today. Our presenter is going to be doing kind of an open dialogue, so she has a few slides to present. She has actually a fairly robust presentation, and she's going to welcome questions from the audience throughout. So normally we have a Q&A at the end. Today we're going to do the presentation, and then we are going to do small group discussions. So we're going to break into little small groups. We think probably of 4 or 5 people, and then the Positive Living peer navigators are going to be the leaders of those small group discussions. We've given everybody a feedback form at your place at the table. So if you look through that, the first page really sort of identifies some basic demographics, asking who you are, where you come from. We try to keep that as open as possible, so it's not self-identifying. It's just about trying to find out what types of people in the community we're able to reach. And then part of this evaluation today is going to be used in the small group discussions at the end as well. Our presentation today is supported by Gilead Pharmaceuticals, Merck, and ViiV Healthcare, and so we're very grateful to them for their support. I already talked about the evaluations. They'll be on your table. Our presenter today is going to be Lindsay Killam. Lindsay is a social worker at the RAC at St. Paul's Hospital. RAC is the Rapid Access Addictions Clinic. So Lindsay's worked in the field of addiction and mental health for the past 2 decades. Her career started at the Dr. Peter Center and A Loving Spoonful in the late 90s. Her exposure to the developing issues in the downtown east side inspired her to get her master's degree in social work from UBC and start a career in addiction counseling. Lindsay spent 10 years as a concurrent disorders clinician at Vancouver Coastal Health, and more recently acted as a national clinical program director for an online harm reduction treatment program for alcohol use disorder. She's currently employed as a social worker at the Rapid Access Addictions Clinic at St. Paul's Hospital. Lindsay aspires to empower her clients through connection and advocacy. So if you'll all just welcome Lindsay. Thank you very much.
Back in 1996, when I was fresh out of my first university degree, that I, through a series of events, ended up working for A Loving Spoonful and eventually to the Dr. Peter Center when it opened up around the same time. And that was a time when there was a lot of change happening in Vancouver. It was when the issues in the downtown east side around IV drug use were just coming to the forefront. And my mind was pretty blown at that time as a person in my early 20s of watching this change take place. And that's what really inspired me to go and get my master's and focus my career on addiction. And so for the better part of that career, I would say most of my counseling has been in response to opiate use, more recently amphetamine use that is at the forefront these days, and not actually a lot of talk about alcohol. And I was very privileged a few years ago to have an opportunity to kind of switch gears in my career and start working for a private company that was doing online alcohol treatment. And it was doing it from a harm reduction lens, which comes out of Europe, which is called the Sinclair method. And really, I had never, in all of my career and working in addiction, I'd never really heard anyone talk about alcohol use as something that could be done in moderation if it was a problem. That people might be able to reduce to quit. The language around alcohol use that I had really experienced as a helping professional and in my personal life was that you either were okay to be a drinker or you were an addict, and that there wasn't much in between. It was, and if you were an addict, you could never drink again. So it was interesting and really enlightening to go through this experience of working for a company that really took a broader lens on alcohol use and how we might start to look at alcohol and our relationship with alcohol and be able to make decisions for any individual or anyone helping another individual about what might be right for any given person. So that's what I'm going to focus on today, and hopefully give you some ideas or challenge your thinking around how people experience drinking and how people experience problem drinking. So some stats for you. 18% of Canadians over the age of 15 have had an alcohol use disorder during their lifetime. So what's interesting about that is that it's not giving that statistic as a static, that people actually are fluid in their alcohol use, and that sometimes people do identify as having a problem and other times they don't over the course of a lifetime. 18% is about 6 million Canadians, so that's a lot of our population. 1 in 5 Canadians aged 12 or older drink in excess of the recommended daily limits on a fairly regular basis, I would say, in many parts of Canada. And I'll talk about what those limits are, and you can see why people end up over those limits often. Economic cost. So alcohol use is a $14.6 billion cost to Canadian taxpayers every year. It exceeds tobacco and it exceeds other substances. by quite a lot. So when we're talking about those costs, we're talking about costs in healthcare, costs in mental health, costs in lost time at work. It captures sort of the whole economy when it's looking at those costs. I believe, I don't think I have the slide for it, I don't, that in BC there was something like 77,000 hospitalizations due to alcohol use per year on average. So big impact. So when we talk about alcohol use and sort of making those decisions around what is moderate drinking, what is healthy drinking, what is unhealthy drinking, really the starting point is taking a look at what a drink is. And I know for me, when I look at some of this information and I look at my own drinking patterns, I am sometimes or get shocked at really what a standard drink is and how people consume alcohol in day-to-day life. So things like beer, a bottle of beer is basically a standard drink or a can. Where this gets tricky though these days is that we have all of these different fancy beers out there, boutique beers, and a lot of them are not 5%. It is not uncommon now to have beer that is 7, 8, 9%. And that's a whole different ballgame when you talk about what a standard drink would be. It's similar with ciders. People used to think of cider as sort of that moderate light drink to have. And certainly if you're having a bottle of cider that's 5%, it probably is a nice light drink to have. Reality is, if you look at most ciders on the shelf, you're rarely going to find a 5% cider. They again commonly get up to 8 or 9%, where having one bottle is actually a pretty significant amount of alcohol. It's the wine piece, though, that surprises a lot of people, and that is that a standard glass of wine is 5 ounces of alcohol. And I can bet that if any of you have a history of consuming wine, that you rarely have had a 5-ounce glass of wine. Interestingly, in restaurants, if you look at the menu, it's usually a 6 or 8 ounce option or a 6 and 9 ounce option for wine. So, the industry out there that's serving liquor doesn't even go by these standards. If you are free pouring wine at home, you're probably pouring an average of 7 or 8 ounces. In the last 50 years, we know that the actual average size of a wine glass, has increased significantly. So if you think of the wine glasses that might have been on your grandmother's table, they probably looked like little port glasses. They were tiny, little crystal glasses. And now, it's not uncommon to go into a restaurant and find a wine glass. It's like a fishbowl. It's huge, huge. Like there's glasses that you could pour almost a whole bottle of wine into, and it wouldn't look like that much. So it really is interesting and something to look at when you consume wine or when you see people consuming wine on what that really is that they're drinking, because it is not hard to go over recommended guidelines, in one night, even if the glass is big enough that you're measuring. And then hard liquor is 1.5 ounces, so that's basically a shot size glass. And again, that varies a little bit depending on what the hard alcohol is, and that's generally based on the alcohol content in vodka. Any questions or thoughts on that? So that gives you a picture of what a standard glass is. Let's talk about what the sort of standards for healthy drinking are, or low-risk drinking. And it's an interesting concept that we sort of talk in terms of healthy drinking, because in reality, there is no healthy amount of alcohol. Any alcohol consumption can have health, social consequences, or psychological consequences in people's lives. But based on the Canadian health guidelines that are put forward, They have sort of made a standard that's out there of basically what would be seen as a normal or average drinking pattern, one that is unlikely to lead to problem drinking for people. However, I always say that with a caveat, having worked in the field for 20 years, that even these standards where people say, oh, you know, this is what will keep you in the range of health and well-being, it very much depends on your own personal life and your relationships on whether this is healthy or not. I have certainly had people come into my office who say they have, you know, 1 glass of wine a night or have a few glasses of wine on the weekends, and it's causing problems in their life, and they want to make changes to that. I've also had people who far exceed these guidelines who think that they're doing okay in life. So, you know, it really varies, and that's where I really challenge you to sort of think about what defines normal and what defines healthy when you think about that relationship with alcohol. So for women, it's 10 drinks per week with no more than 2 drinks per day. Women who consume over 3 drinks on any given drinking session it is considered to be a binge. With men, it's 15 drinks per week with no more than 3 drinks per day. And I believe with men, if it's more than 5 drinks in one drinking session, it's considered a binge. So that's really interesting as well, because I know for myself and my own reference point, if I went out for a night out with friends and had 4 or 5 drinks, I certainly never thought of myself as being on a binge. Yet that's what the health standards indicate. And certainly you could argue if you wake up the next morning and you're not feeling very good, then yeah, it was probably too many drinks and would constitute a binge. Within these guidelines, it's also saying that you know, while it's saying 3 drinks per day or 2 drinks per day, there should be non-drinking days in between. And I'll talk a bit more about that in some of the coming slides about why that is significant, why you should have days where there is not alcohol consumption. Any comments or thoughts on that? Yeah.
What do you define low risk as? Low risk to what?
I think that's a really good question. And that's where these actually, these standards get challenged a lot in what exactly that means, when we're also at the same time saying that any alcohol can cause problems. So low risk is meaning low risk in acquiring problem drinking or developing dependency on alcohol. Any questions? Yeah.
I was wondering why there's such a huge discrepancy between women and men when it's for the amount of drinks is considered low risk or high risk. That's a huge difference.
Also a good question. Something I have wondered myself often, because you know all you have to do is look around a room and people are all different sizes and weights and heights, and so really it's very relative. You know, if a woman is 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, her ability to metabolize alcohol is going to be very different than somebody who is 100 pounds and 5 feet tall. Same goes for men. Yeah.
Does this change for a teen that's just of age, both male and female?
That's a good question. They don't actually change the guidelines based on age, but there would certainly be factors at different times of life that might, I think, make that healthy relationship with alcohol change. What we do know is that youth are far more likely to binge drink. We also know that women and older adults are increasing in their problem drinking at a rapid rate these days. So there's a lot that I think in the next probably 5 years we're going to see changing in potentially how we look at problem drinking and different stages of life. Historically, nobody researched older adults. There's really a belief around, well, if you've lived your life and you want to drink and you're 70, you go for it. And that's actually still largely true out there in a lot of places, that we kind of just ignore people at a certain age with their bad habits. Yeah.
The way you holistic, because I'm an adult child of an alcoholic, my dad's an AA, I understand the idea behind it. I sometimes break the low risk, but I don't have the tendency to be too alcoholic. So is there like a definite definition between alcoholism and then drinking for maintaining life?
Great question. And yes, there is a difference. So we now measure problem drinking along a scale. So it's a spectrum from non-drinker to addiction, so dependency. So the sort of classic alcoholic is on the range of dependency. We use the DSM scale, which is in the psychiatric manual, and rate based on, I believe it's 12 factors, and how you score on those for mild, moderate to severe drinking. We also know that only about 10%, so less than 10% of the population falls in the range of dependency or classic alcoholic. Most people who have a problematic relationship with alcohol fall in the moderate area of well, I guess you could argue addiction. It's measuring addiction. And that's why we see sort of drinking rates ebb and flow, or people who describe sometimes in their life that they might have had a very problematic relationship with alcohol, and then something changes in their life and they don't anymore. We're really just opening up that conversation now in healthcare about what that looks like, and stepping out of just looking at that less than 10% people who really have to stop in order to be healthy. Yeah.
Along the lines of what Ken was saying there, it's like I come from an alcoholic family, both parents. And I've had my bouts with alcoholism as well. And I've had social times as well, but I hardly drink at all now. And there's nothing really any different. You know, but I've gone through every stage you possibly could have with it.
Yeah. So that's a great example of how that relationship can change over a
Never been
lifetime.
treatment related. I've never had treatment for it or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly. And yet another person might spend their entire life going in and out of treatment and trying to stay safe around alcohol use. Thank you. Yeah, a couple more questions and I'll move on.
These are great questions. I've loved this. So when you're talking about low risk, it feels like a very traditional term to me. And as a long-term HIV person, you know, this is a new thing for us, and organ inflammation is, we're just learning more and more about that. I don't think we have all the answers, but we're learning. Like it feels like it's an extra layer of risk that is probably not being measured in the research right now, and I wondered if that's the case, or are people expanding the definition of risk to include other physical disabilities or challenges?
Great point. This is not based on measuring against any of the other health and psychological and social variables that come into play. It is purely based on probably quite arbitrary numbers of basically, I think, what leads to organ problems specifically related to alcohol use over time. So I always present this, but I always challenge people to use this as a guide and actually really start to look at alcohol in terms of your own relationship with it and what influences you in your own life with healthy and unhealthy drinking. There was one more, and then I'll move on. Yes.
Yeah, I think I might have had a problem. They have designated drivers to get you home. And you can drink. I needed one just to get to the bar. If you wake up, if you pass up the front lawn, you might have a problem.
I think that
Or
might
you wake up
define
naked in
problem.
strange places.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for all those really good questions. Oh,
One quick question, just related to
Yes.
that it might facilitate that discussion in the small groups.
Mhm.
But just about, sort of inflammation issues.
Mhm.
There's also things like comorbidities, like liver disease, like hepatitis, that
Yes.
we see a lot of in our community especially. So
yeah.
I just wanted to comment on that.
Yes, and I appreciate that you brought that up. I'll come to that in a little more detail when we talk about the understanding risk and taking a look at risks, because as pointed out, living with certain illnesses or certain mental health issues, all kinds of things can really change what healthy drinking looks like. So I've touched on this a little bit, that this really is about relationship, and relationship with alcohol can be influenced in many different ways. And science is telling us a lot these days about how alcohol affects the body, why it is that some people become dependent on it and other people don't. This just gives a bit of an overview of some of the influences we know. Some of the important pieces around this is some of the challenges that are coming up around alcoholism being purely defined as a disease. We are learning that there's actually a lot more context to that than how it has historically been viewed. So some things we do know about how problem substance use develops is that alcohol use affects the reward system in the brain. So when you consume alcohol, it releases all kinds of feel-good endorphins that flood that reward center. That reward center in our brain is a very primitive part of our brain. Some people call it the beast brain because it's a part of our brain we share with all of the animal kingdom that is a survivalist part of our brain. So that part of our brain gets all of those feel-good endorphins coming to it, and it says, wow, hey, whatever this is I'm getting right now feels good, and I'm going to inventory that this feels good, and I'm going to ask for more of it. So that part of our brain doesn't actually have any sense of past, future, or consequence. It is just an inventory of what the brain feels it believes it needs to survive. So some people are more vulnerable to that than others. That part of the brain is what directs even so-called healthy drinkers to become intoxicated. As when the first drink happens, we get euphoria, it feels good. That part of the brain then says, wow, let's have another one of those. And when you have the second glass of, let's say, wine, the brain gets flooded again. And usually by about the time the second glass is finished, that flooding in the brain is overpowering the brain's ability to uptake all of those endorphins. And that's when decision-making changes. So by the time somebody has finished a third drink, for many people, it's game over and they're going to continue drinking. If somebody has a problematic relationship with alcohol, those pathways are like superhighways for those endorphins, and that feeling of out of control can actually happen within the first couple of sips. It's actually actively triggered just by having the taste of the alcohol. So that's what science tells us. That is really fundamentally why alcoholism is labeled a disease, because there is that sense of being out of control, and there is an actual chemical reaction that happens in the brain. Some of the new research on alcohol use, though, and problem drinking extends beyond just that chemistry of the brain and is taking a look at learning. So there's a lot of theories about learning, and are you guys familiar with the concept of Pavlov's dog? Yeah. So basically, there's a body of research that says that humans, we are like Pavlov's dog as well. And that when we have years of drinking under our belt, we have actually started to develop associations with alcohol that actually send us messages to the brain. We build pathways in the brain that tell us to drink in certain situations. Sometimes that won't be a problem for people. Other times it will end up being a big problem. For example, one of the big triggers that a lot of people find they have over time is when they feel stressed. When stress happens, that self-talk happens of a drink would really help with this stress. That connection is there because there's a history of having felt stress, consumed alcohol, felt better, and that messaging stays in the brain. The more we do it, the more we practice, the more we build those neural pathways. So it's a very interesting way of looking at how habit formation happens and how triggers start to happen, and why people who often will say, well, I don't get it because, 5 years ago, I could stop at one drink, or I could go past the bar and not feel triggered to go in, and now I can't help myself. And it really gets down to the practice makes perfect. The more you do something, the more automatic it becomes, the more natural it becomes. The same way it is as learning how to ski or learning a new language. When you're first doing it, you have to think about every muscle movement, every word you're thinking, whatever it is. But the more you do it, the less you think about that. That's body memory. It's also neuroplasticity, so the idea that the brain is always growing. The good thing about the theory of learning is that what it tells us is that things we can learn that are unhealthy, we can also unlearn. So practicing new behaviors actually builds new neural pathways and can lead to healthier decision making. So it's an interesting dynamic that science is showing us now, that there's chemistry, but there's also an active participation that happens in creating the compulsion to drink and creating the triggers that lead to drinking. So in amongst that, we have all of these other variables as well. So genetics, we know that genetics plays a role and makes some people more vulnerable than others. Testing on that is just starting to evolve. Drug interactions, so medications for all kinds of illnesses can interact with alcohol and affect the way people experience drinking. Dependency affects people's relationship with alcohol, so if you have reached that point where you require alcohol to feel okay in the day, then it's going to affect how much someone needs to consume to just feel normal. We have the psychological effects, so learning, as I spoke about, mental health, stress, coping skills, triggers, all kinds of things that fall in that thinking realm around alcohol consumption. And then we have the social implications. So for many people, introduction into alcohol use, and probably still in alcohol use, it's about connection. It's about enjoying time with other people, maybe enjoying time with peers and family. We learn a lot within our tight social systems about what's normal and what's not normal, what's okay and what's not okay. It's why some families don't consume any alcohol and others, party it up and feel like it's great. Our education plays a role, so we know that people who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have more problems with alcohol. What social norms are, so that's a very interesting thing to look at across the world and culturally as well, as to what constitutes problem drinking and what doesn't, what is deemed as normal drinking, and then socioeconomics in general. Any thoughts or questions about that, Mark?
I also find the way it's marketed, for as long as I can remember, the drinking, it's fun, it's social. They show you the fun part, and they will show you bar fights at the bar. But it's actually, it's a social thing to go for a drink after work, or and with their clinic too, I was really surprised, when we opened it for the opioid crisis, it's like 20% of people come in with alcohol use disorder, and and most of the seniors, like living by themselves, drinking themselves. They're alone and they don't have the support. But yeah, it's so market. If you're not drinking, you're kind of like out of it.
Yeah.
You're not cool.
In North America in particular, we have a huge cultural norm around alcohol use, and what happens is people's problems don't get identified. And I agree with you that it is a particular issue in Vancouver where the opioid crisis is so significant that it trumps conversations about other issues, sometimes to the detriment of the people experiencing those issues. Yeah. And some of that comes from the fact that, you know, when we look at something like, you know, overdoses and IV drug use, you know, it is very real and very immediate, whereas deaths that happen because of alcohol use tend to happen over a long period of time. And so there's not that same sense of crisis around alcohol use. And it's very unfortunate because
And
people
there's
get
the
lost.
The stigma of being an alcoholic as well, right?
Yes,
So,
yes.
I don't want to be an alcoholic. So.
And that stigma is very interesting because it very much comes from that whole view that we have about what an alcoholic is. So it makes for a very interesting conversation when you change that conversation to talking about, well, what is moderate use? What is healthy use? Why is it a problem for some people and not another? All of a sudden that opens up the doors. And one of the interesting experiences that I had in working for a harm reduction alcohol treatment program was that probably about 70% of the people who signed up for that program were people who would say, if I had to go to 12-step or if I was told I could never drink again, I would not show up for help. But when you change it to a framework of, let's see where you are right now and how we can help you in making small changes that might lead to not drinking. Many people, it was still about eventually getting to a place of not drinking. But taking away that pass or fail idea or some of that stigma around what an alcoholic is, it opens doors for people to feel welcome or for people to develop their own ideas about change. Very empowering once we change the language on what a problem is. Yes.
You know, like I think nowadays, so that it's more common to talk about alcoholism. I know from my background, my grandparents and all that stuff were heavy drinkers, but to be able to talk to my family about alcoholism in our family, it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, and I just accept that that's where they are, right? For me, when I first went into AA 25 years ago, it was like the idea of stopping drinking forever was like a big deal, right? And that's what compelled me to not want to go there. But once I did, and it was like 24 hours, and you know, one led to another, and life got better.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that and that experience of having to take that first step to walk through the door, and it is a big challenge, and some people are very lucky to have that personal conviction or to have that support system behind them that helps them make that first step, and other people don't have it and find themselves really struggling in social isolation. You know, the irony of alcohol use and with most drug use in general is that people are usually compelled to start drinking because it brings a feeling of connection, but as soon as that switch turns to being a problem, it's actually such a source of social isolation.
Thank you. In thinking of the standards that we were talking about before, and what you mentioned about how in North America socialization, etc. happens, I wonder if there is any relation or study or facts about how this happens in other cultures, in other countries, being us in Canada so multicultural and having so many people from different places. I don't know if there is any relation or concern about that.
That is an excellent thought, and I don't know studies offhand. However, I'm sure there is. And probably the place to find them would be on the CAMH website. I imagine there's some very interesting conversations that are happening around that. Yeah. Interestingly, the whole idea of harm reduction alcohol consumption came out of Finland originally, and Finland has the highest per capita alcohol consumption rates in the world. And they basically made all of their alcohol sales government regulated, and all of the profits that came from that government regulated system went into research into the harms of alcohol use, and therefore a model of harm reduction came out of it because they realized people were not getting help and people were really, really sick. So it's amazing sometimes how these things unfold in some places and then the discussion never happens in others. Yes?
I mean, alcohol got a lot of us old birds. I mean, it was the main central thing you did is go to a gay bar, you know, in Stonewall times, and cocaine as well. I mean, it was what you did. And I mean, in Finland, it was their way of life, drinking. It was a way of life.
Yeah.
So they had to change it,
Yeah.
you know. And it was just common, you drank.
Yeah. And a lot of those places where it's cold and dark for a lot of the year, it became a cultural norm. It's a way to pass time.
Very friendly.
Yeah. Very friendly, yes. Thank you, excellent question. So how do we know when it's a problem? You know, if we're looking at it as this thing that's multi-layered and, you know, very relative to individual experience, how do we know when it's a problem? So there are several factors that we can look at. And the first one that I wanted to look at is risks. So really understanding what the risks are to any individual person, but also the risks specifically to people who are HIV positive. So, you know, in general risks, when people consume alcohol, they can experience injuries, accidents, and falls. They can end up driving while impaired, experience violence, partner violence, sexual assault, which are significant. The numbers are very high of what people experience in terms of sexual assault when intoxicated, and it's highly underreported. So, you know, that is a very real experience for a lot of people. High-risk sexual behavior, multiple partners, and STIs. So when we look at some of the research and risks associated to people with HIV, this comes up as one of the most significant risks for people in terms of acquiring HIV, in terms of spreading HIV, in terms of acquiring other disorders, other illnesses that can affect somebody living with HIV. So definitely something to think about in how does someone's alcohol consumption affect their decision making at any given time in relation to high-risk behavior, sexual partners, any number of things.
Can you tell me what you mean by multiple partners?
Multiple partners, they don't give much definition on that when it comes up in the risks, but you know, you can imagine what it might mean. So it might mean, you know, multiple partners in a single sexual experience. It might mean having, you know, multiple committed partners, I suppose, as well. But it comes down to the risks. So what they might say is someone who has multiple partners and consumes alcohol might make the decision not to use a condom and put those other partners at risk. Those kinds of things come up in the conversation, but they don't specifically define it. It's an interesting thought to bring up.
It's a loaded term.
It is a loaded term.
Because if people are drinking too much and not using condoms or having unprotected sex in some fashion, that's a high-risk sexual behavior. It fits under that category.
Yes.
The multiple partners, it feels like a really judgmental, heteronormative construct that I don't think is necessarily accurate in this particular area.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's a good point in how those labels are created and perpetuated. Missing taking medications. This goes for any medications, but it does show specifically around ARVs and people who are on any kind of regimented or routine around taking medications, that people, sometimes when they consume a large amount of alcohol have lost time or physical illness, hangovers, those kinds of things that might affect sticking to a medication routine. Alcohol use can affect mental health. Oh, yes.
It's interesting, besides missing taking medications, that it does not also add the effect that drinking can have on medications.
Yes.
Because there are a lot of medications when mixed with alcohol have various effects. So.
Absolutely. Interactions are a big piece of that relationship with alcohol. Technically, in a lot of the research on alcohol and ARVs, they say there isn't a direct interaction with alcohol and most medications. However, that always depends on how much alcohol is consumed and how alcohol is affecting other organs in the body. So it's always a relative thing on what that norm is around alcohol use. And
It depends on the person's system too.
absolutely, absolutely, other health factors that are at play. Yep. Thank you. The piece around mental health, though, is I think of stress, anxiety, and depression. So alcohol is a depressant, and certainly long-term use, most people find that they don't feel very good. Usually creates a sense of apathy. Depression also goes hand in hand with any kind of chronic or long-term illness as well. So not HIV specific, but any kind of disorder or illness that affects somebody's health long-term can also have a concurrent factor that goes with it. Depression being one of the most significant ones. The other interesting thing about alcohol use is that a lot of people consume alcohol to manage anxiety and stress, that it gives that sensation of relieving anxiety and stress. And certainly it does, usually with the first drink. But what we find is that people who drink heavily or drink on a regular basis actually start to say that their anxiety increases when they consume alcohol on a regular basis or overconsume alcohol on a regular basis. So there's that psychological piece of what we think it's doing for us, and then the reality of the impact it has on us physically and mentally. Drinking can also affect eating habits. Yes?
I don't know if it would qualify under mental health, but working at a gay bar for many years, I've noticed a lot of people have underdeveloped social skills. So in other words, they can't be really social unless they're drinking, right?
Yes.
I can't go for coffee with them. You can't.
Yep.
A lot of things you just can't do. So I don't know if that qualifies under mental health. It would.
Sure. Courage in the bottom of every glass. Social lubricant, all those kinds of things that people associate with alcohol use, which would fall in the category of social anxiety, right? That people feel they need it to be able to feel connected to others or to socialize. Yeah.
Does that usually start younger? So did that really sort of depending, like when you develop your social skills, such as in your late teens or?
That's a really good question. So we know that maturation, so maturing in life, emotionally and psychologically, can get stunted at the point of problem drinking. So if somebody starts drinking early or develops heavy drinking, in their teen years, they often don't grow emotionally to, I think, nurture some of those social skills that are required in adult life. The positive is that when people stop drinking, they do still have the ability to develop those skills with support. Yes?
Sort of feeding into that, because I was in the 12-step program through my father for many, many years, The one thing that I noticed is that to the courage at the bottom of the glass, when you would go to a social, it would take quite a while before people would get up and dance at an event because they all had to, and it was really more about the self-confidence and the comfortable with being who you are and everything like that. But when you go to a 12-step program event where there's a dance element, I mean, the band starts playing and the dance floor is full because those people have gotten past that barrier of being able to feel comfortable in their own skin and just get out and not worry about everybody else.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah, it's amazing the psychological attachment. I think that we all experience around alcohol, that it's going to help us get up and work the room. And it does to a degree, but there's a limit. There's, again, when that switch turns, it turns, and all of a sudden you are not the life of the party anymore. Yes?
So, I was wondering about sleep and sleep interruption and the
Yes.
cycle of sleep, because we know even if you stop drinking coffee by dinner time, it still cycles through your system
Yes.
and you wake up throughout the night. Do you know anything around alcohol in that same? Is it the same?
I do.
Okay.
So it's not up here, but it is something that probably should be up here. And so what people often find is that they like to consume alcohol in the evening because it makes them feel groggy and they can fall asleep better. So that's a common issue that comes up when people come in for therapy and want help in making change. The unfortunate thing is it helps you fall asleep faster, but as your body processes the alcohol, it actually wakes people up at night. So people actually end up with more disrupted sleep when they consume alcohol, even though they feel like they can fall asleep better. One of the first changes most people experience when they reduce or cut alcohol out is that they find they sleep through the night. Yeah. One last piece is the liver complications. I wanted to bring this one up because the liver is such a significant organ in terms of processing medications and is vulnerable in the body in so many ways. So this actually goes both ways in terms of people's experience with HIV, is that medications can sometimes cause inflammation, and the liver will experience some of that inflammation. The liver is where some medications are processed. Things like hepatitis C can also affect the vulnerability of the liver. And then the flip side of that is that if people are consuming a lot of alcohol, that is very hard on the liver and can affect the liver's capacity to process. So it goes both ways. I highlighted that one just because it is such a significant piece around that relationship with the body and how we process toxins in the body and how we process medications. Yes?
So I've kind of always been interested in that liver piece, and especially in relation to moderate or healthy drinking, as we're discussing now. Like what, in that sense of lighter drinking, what kind of impacts, like how does that much alcohol really cause damage to the liver? Like at what point do we really see that, okay, this is now a problem? In a relatively healthy liver, let's say.
So in a relatively healthy liver, it is a very fascinating thing. So when I worked with the alcohol program, we would do liver tests on people, and we would come across people who had been very heavy drinkers for a very long time, who had very good numbers in their liver counts. Other people who did not identify as being overly heavy drinkers, shorter term, who had very high liver counts, and I think that's where your individual health comes into play, and the other risks, or other implications in the body and medications and health history come into play. I don't think there is, any sort of timeline that people have on when problems will start to happen. Similar to smoking, right? Like some people develop COPD very early on in smoking. Other people, you hear about who've been 2-pack-a-day smokers for 50 years and they seem to be in good health. So it's very tricky, and it's really important when you have any kind of compromised immune system for any reason to have a very good picture of what your individual health is and the risks for you in everyday life, and to look at that relationship with alcohol and moderate it in reflection to your own experiences and your own health needs.
For sure. Well, I think it's interesting that you kind of use that analogy with cigarettes as well, so smoking tobacco. So I've heard doctors say that smoking tobacco is actually not that horrible if you're very young or if you're very old, for two reasons. Because when you're very young, your body's probably going to recover if you quit smoking at an early age. And then if you're very old, you're going to die before the damage is really good. So it's interesting. I'm curious about if that's similar for alcohol.
I would guess that you would come across doctors who might say the same thing about alcohol. And the unfortunate thing is that alcohol has probably been very understudied on taking those liver counts and seeing what the real impact is in long-term consumption. Most doctors, when you go for a checkup, are not going to check your liver counts. And it might be something you have to ask for if you're curious about that. If you're taking medications that are metabolized in the liver, then you might be getting those numbers on a regular basis. Yes?
Yeah, I thought, I quit drinking about 3 years ago, but I went to Scotland in September and I had a few drinks, just a few drinks while I was there. And when I got back, I had my blood work done, which my liver enzymes were really, really high. So it's funny that when you don't drink and then you have a drink, can that really affect the liver? Or is that just...
Hard to say, but I would imagine, anecdotally, yes. If you're not used to processing alcohol anymore and you introduce that to the body, it's probably going to, bump it up, but it will probably go back down quite quickly.
It went back down.
Yeah.
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 I was just going to comment, and you started into it about our blood work, and I think that some people can get really over obsessive about their blood work, and we don't want that. But it can also be very informative, and liver enzyme tests are pretty much in most of our regular blood work, and to pay attention to that, because quite a few years back, I was drinking a lot in the summer, and my doctor was able to say, you get back to drinking a lot in the summer because it's September and your liver enzymes are starting to kick up again. And so I'd stop drinking and everything would calm back down. But I think it's an excellent biofeedback that we actually have as a community, because not everybody goes and gets regular blood work, and so take advantage of that. I feel like I'm a little bit preaching to the choir, but I think it's worth mentioning to pay attention to your blood work. It's very informative.
It is worth mentioning, and you have a good doctor if your doctor is having those conversations, because most doctors don't. Yeah. Yes?
I was wondering, in the same, when we talk about addiction, like addiction, we talked about tolerance of the body to certain drugs. Is it the same, and can we say it about alcoholism? So is it in the same manner that the body just tolerates a certain amount of alcohol?
Yes. So the more you drink, the more tolerance you develop, and you require more alcohol to receive that euphoric effect over time. Yes.
I'm really interested in the harm reduction of alcohol. We'll talk about later. But I also noticed that with long-term people who are alcoholics, and they can quit for 20 years, 15 years, and so once they drink, they pick up. I mean, they have no tolerance, right? And they're back right where they started.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm all about harm reduction too.
Yeah. So, the interesting thing about neuroplasticity of the brain is we always have the ability to develop new neural pathways, but the old neural pathways don't go away. So that's why someone can be doing great and not crave a drink, but then find a drink in their hand, and 2 days later they're down for the count again, and it's just because all of those pathways have lit up again right away. So one of the interesting things when we look at harm reduction around alcohol use is that it takes a model of slowly changing those pathways and developing new coping skills as people go along. So instead of sort of having to do that cold turkey change, we end up having slow construction of the new pathways and more skills behind it to be able to cope when when tough times come up. And
So-
we'll probably done on time.
Yeah, I'm just mentioning that it's almost 7, so we've had actually a
Okay.
really robust conversation for almost an hour, so.
Oh, my goodness.
I'm just actually going to scoot past you, I just wanted to note that.
Apologies, there's no clock in here, so I've just been,
And there's no super rush, but I just want to make sure that there's enough time for a small group discussion.
absolutely, absolutely. You guys have so many great questions. Thanks for a good conversation. So the very last slide I have is looking at consequences. So there's making decisions based on what your personal risks are that will inform you about what moderate drinking is to you or to people in your life. And then there's taking a look at, well, what are the consequences? And this goes back to that whole idea of how someone might be a 1 drink a night drinker and have significant consequences in their life. And other people might consume quite large amounts on a regular basis and feel like it doesn't affect them much at all. And so these are some of the things to consider when really evaluating whether alcohol use is a problem or not. Yes.
For myself, I actually didn't realize I had a problem. I just kept going to the bars, and I was drinking out every day. And when I actually had gone and met someone that didn't drink, and the next 2 days after, I went through withdrawal in a major way. Went to my doctor, and he's the one that said to me, like, you know, it looks like you're going through alcohol withdrawal.
Yeah.
But it wasn't something I even thought about.
Yeah. And I imagine your story is like many people's stories where just that feeling of discomfort when not drinking becomes such a norm that you lose perspective on what it's like to actually feel healthy.
Well, I have 12 years of my life that I don't remember, basically, when I moved here to when I stopped drinking. Basically, I don't have a lot of memories of the people I met or what I did, so.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So I'll wrap up so that we have time for the table conversations, but you can just take a look at these consequences that arise from alcohol use. And certainly, you know, if several of these are happening in your life or in the life of a loved one, it's worthy of taking a look at what that relationship to alcohol looks like and how change might take place to make that relationship healthier. Thank you.